Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today it is time to do the Week 1 review of the 2024 United Football League season. This Week 1 was a massive success, whether it be the fact that all four games were legitimately close games in the fourth quarter, whether it be the fact that the attendance was overall pretty solid, or the TV ratings, which they were pretty good. This week was overall a massive success. Everything that we'd hoped would happen essentially did happen. There were a couple minor disappointments, but all in all, this was an incredible week. That's not even considering the fact that we had a couple huge upsets. So without further ado, let's just get right on into this by first looking at the overall scores of the four games. Now, the first game between the Stallions and Renegades, the Battle of the Champions, ended up having the Stallions win 27-14. Then the second game of the day had the Michigan Panthers just barely beat the St. Louis Battlehawks 18-16. Then on Sunday, we had the Brahmas face the Defenders, winning that game 27-12 over DC. And then the final game had the Memphis Showboats beating the Roughnecks 18-12. Now, while some of these scores seem like they're pretty lopsided, the fact is both the Stallions, Renegades, and Defenders Brahmas games actually were a lot closer than those final scores indicate, as that was mainly due to what happened at the very end of the fourth quarter, as overall they were incredibly tight games. Now, starting off with looking at game one between the Stallions and the Renegades, and you'll notice that this was a very solid game through the first half of it. Essentially what happened at the very end of the half, Skip Holtz decided to do an insanely ballsy call. Instead of going for what we expected, which was to do a short pass outside to gain a couple yards for a field goal, they instead decided to do a deep shot just out of nowhere, and ended up working. It was like a 40-yard touchdown pass from Matt Corral to Deon Cain, and that gave him a touchdown that made it tied at half. Then after the third quarter, the Renegades were down a little bit, but in the end, thanks to a late interception, things like that, the Stallions were able to win the game 27-14. The fact is that while both quarterbacks in Luis Perez and Matt Corral had some little downs, the fact is they both looked pretty solid. Essentially, right when that Deon Cain pass hit, Matt Corral went from having a pretty bad game to actually looking like a very solid spring football quarterback. Adrian Martinez, before he got hurt, wasn't the best passing, but was incredible to watch running the ball. And overall, this was actually one of the better rushing performances across the entire spring football week, as every other game had either only one team or no team run the ball well, and Letty Brown's 3.8 average and CJ Maribel's 3.7 were really the two highest if you're looking at just the top running back from each team. That was overall pretty solid. The fact was that this was a very good game to watch. It was a very close game for a lot of it, and it wasn't until midway through the fourth quarter it really kind of got out of the way and ended up being a Stallions win. And even then, it was still pretty close in the fourth quarter. This was a very entertaining game and a really solid one, all things considered. It was a great way to start the UFL season and overall the UFL. Now, the next game is the crazy Battlehawks Panthers. This is a game that the ending is what really made this one crazy. Essentially, heading into the fourth quarter, this was a very, very low-scoring game, whether it be because the Panthers' offense was just not firing on any cylinders or the Panthers' defense were just absolutely suffocating the Battlehawks' offense. In the fourth quarter, everything changed. Both teams were able to move the ball a bit, anywhere from a bit to a lot better. The Panthers utilized West Hills a lot more, who ended up having the best rushing performance of the week, 11 attempts for 85 yards, a 7.7 average. And in the end, it was the reason they were able to get the W. The fact is the Battlehawks were able to take the lead off a couple, things like a penalty on the Panthers, a couple great catches by Marcel Aitman, and ended up taking a 1-point lead. The Panthers drove down the field about halfway to get a long-range kick for Jake Bates, who, believe it or not, pending which report you believe, hasn't made a kick since before high school. This guy never made a field goal even in high school. He kicked a 64-yarder not once when it got iced, but twice, to end the game with an incredible walk-off, one of the longest game-winning kicks in just football history. It was insane. This is a game that was a very much defensive battle. Now, whether it be because one team's offense was pretty poor, which a lot of people are believing the Panthers was, or if it's one team's defense being incredible, which, again, the Panthers was, this was a very close game up until the end, and the Panthers were able to just edge out the W and get the victory. Then the next game is the Brahmas versus DC, or the Brahmas versus the Defenders. Despite the final score, what it says, this was by far the best game of the week. This is one of the best spring football games we've seen, just period. This is a really good game. The fact is this was a very insane one, whether it be the fact that DC had multiple touchdowns called back due to very crucial penalties, an incredible challenge called by Wade Phillips that ended up negating a touchdown for the Defenders and knocked him back a ton of yards, or the insane Brad Wing to Alex Millette play at the half. This was just a crazy game. Chase Garbers looked really solid in his first ever spring football game. And even though Te'amu did throw the interception late after he got hit really hard and was maybe injured, a lot of people thought, Te'amu looked really solid as well despite having pretty poor showing by the running backs in his team. This is a really entertaining game. The final score does not do this game justice on how close it was. It was very tight-knit for a while. This was a very good game. Easily one of the best spring football games. It shows in the total yardage, very close to each other. It shows in the penalties, very close to each other. It's just the difference is that a lot of the Brahmas penalties weren't in those crucial situations where the defenders' penalties were. This is a very good game, easily one of the best spring football games we've seen, and for opening week, this is arguably the best. This is pretty arguably the second best spring football game for an opening week in the modern era, or ultra-modern era, since the UFL return in 2022. This was an incredible game. Great. Then the last game is the Showboats versus the Roughnecks. The final game kind of was a bore, even though the final score suggests this was a very close game. The fact is, at no point did the Roughnecks really feel in it. It was more so they had a couple great performances. Toby Johnson, the perennial all-USFL lineman, was incredible, and Reuben Foster was somehow even better than him. And they basically carried the Roughnecks to making this a competitive game. Jarrett Garantano ended up proving a lot of Tennessee fans right, as he did not look that good in this game, despite his final stats not being terrible. Case had the one bad interception, but aside from the interception, he looked really solid as well. This was a very close game, and it ended up being the margins that carried a team. The margins of time of possession were heavily in favor of the Showboats. The margin of third down conversions was heavily in favor of the Showboats. Those are the two main reasons why the Showboats were able to get the W in this one. It was a very close game in the score-wise, but feel-wise, the Roughnecks never were really in it. They were just kind of in it by proxy. This was the weakest game of all four, and even then, this is nowhere near as bad as some of the other games we've seen in the opening weeks for spring football. So overall, 4 really solid games. But now let's get into the attendance. Yes, this is where we start with the actual big thing to talk about. So, what was the attendance for week 1? Well, number one, we do have to get, the big elephant out of the room. This was Easter weekend. A lot of these types of holidays are overall pretty bad for attendance and stuff like this, especially since we're not talking about like the NFL where no holiday really matters. But it was actually pretty solid. Now, yes, the fact that we didn't have every game hit 10,000 is a bit of a disappointment, but the two that did, there's kind of reasons for it. Now, number one, the good thing with the Renegades is that the Renegades broke the Renegades record from last year. The Renegades had 14,153 people as a reported attendance, which was by far better than any game they had last year. Last year, their highest was the Week 10 game where they had 1,200 or 12,821. So they were able to beat their best by a significant margin, which is a really good sign. Now, while the Brahmas were just kind of good, the Brahmas were able to have a solid showing. This would be third from what they did last year, better than their final 3 games, but not as good as their first or second game. But was still a solid number, considering the fact that it was Easter Sunday that day. A lot of people would be at church if, for celebrating the holiday or doing things for Easter. The fact they were able to actually compete with some of their attendance is pretty good. And the fact that they look a lot better than last year's team, I would expect this number to go up very quickly. Now, the Roughnecks was a disappointment. Now, there are reasons for this. Again, they went from TD-ECU Stadium to Rice Stadium, so there is a difference in the stadium. This is not the same Roughnecks team. This is the Gamblers that became the Roughnecks. And this was worse than any game they had last year. Last year, they barely hit under 11,000 in Week 9. And aside from that, they never were under 11,000. So hitting under 10,000 is a bit of a disappointment, especially since that was the weakest attendance of the entire week. But again, it was also on Easter Sunday, so a lot of people are, still doing stuff at church, still doing Easter activities and all that. So there is some understanding there. But overall, not horrid. It could have been worse, but hopefully that's the only sub-10,000 game they have this season. Now, with the Panthers, this is a weird one. The USFL, for those of you who didn't keep up last year, they did not actually release attendance figures, so we don't know officially any of them. The only one we really know is that the Showboats Week 1 game was, really popular, but aside from that, we really don't know any numbers. A lot of people are suggesting this is actually a bit better than what they had the past couple of years, or the past year in Michigan. Whether that's fully true or not, again, we don't know for sure, but it did look decent on TV. The 9,400, it was a much louder crowd than basically any game was last year. And again, the fact they got the W is a big deal. A big thing that hurt the Panthers' attendance last year was the fact they had 4 consecutive home games and they lost every single one of them. So getting a home win in a very dramatic fashion like they did is going to help their attendance. I would not be shocked if we see over 10,000. And the other thing to note, and why this isn't terrible, is because their ticket sales actually got pushed back by a couple weeks. because of that issue with getting, Ford Field, the info to the UFL, to Ticketmaster and all that. So, whereas every other team had their tickets or single game tickets available, the Panthers were still waiting on stuff to come out. So, there's a couple week delay there, which definitely did hurt them as well. So, overall, week 1 attendance was really solid. This 11,480 actually is pretty good, and once you, forget about the St. Louis games from the XFL last year, this is pretty close to a lot of the XFL games last year. The fact is, or a lot of the weeks last year, the fact is that teams like the Guardians and the Vipers routinely had under 10,000, and in the Vipers' case, always 6,000. So, again, like I said in my, what the league needs to survive video that I did a couple weeks ago, or what would be, the goals for the season, if they're able to consistently have over 10,000 fans per game, that'd be a really good sign. And considering the fact that the 2 games that this week that didn't have 10,000 were an Easter Sunday game and a team that kind of got hamstrung by bad ticket sales and all that when they came out, this is not bad. This is not great by any means. The Renegades was great, the Brahmas was and the other 2 were both disappointing but understandable. But we'll definitely see a huge boost next week as we have the Battlehawks actually playing a home game in week 2 instead of, having to wait weeks for that to happen. So the attendance expected to jump sky high next week, especially the average. So we'll also see if any of these teams are able to increase. Naturally, that's the main goal, as we saw last year with the Brahmas being a prime example. After their incredible 24,000 opening week, they just tanked, mainly because the team was not as good and a lot of other issues. So hopefully we see these attendance numbers continue to grow for these 4 teams. But overall, not bad, not great, solid. And then finally, we're going to be looking at the TV ratings. And, well, they were pretty good. So, the one disappointment is the Renegade Stallions. This was a disappointment. I'm seeing a lot of people say this was a good thing. I actually am disagreeing. This is a disappointment. 1.18 million. Number one, yes, this is the best game Fox has had basically since the opening week of the 2022 USFL, admittedly. But this was a game I was fully expecting to do a lot better than that. The fact is, this was a huge market game. This was the USFL versus XFL champion colliding. And yes, it did go against, Elite 8 games. I believe it was around the same time you had the Texas-Purdue game going on. But 1.18 million and not even being the best game of the week is very disappointing. I think that one was a disappointment. Over 1 million is great, especially on Fox. But when you consider everything around it, I personally think it was a slight disappointment. Now, that disappointment is the opposite with the Michigan Panthers Battlehawks. That was incredible. That was a huge success. They were able to beat out the opening game and hit 1.349 million. That is the best game Fox has had that was not the opening week of 2022. That is a massive success. And again, you had to battle against other games as well, or other games. Oh, my bad. I'm my bad about Texas Purdue. That was a different day, I believe. But they still had to battle against Elite 8, just not that game I was thinking of. But the fact is that this was an incredible game. The Panthers versus Battlehawks, the fact they were able to hit 1.349 million is insane. A huge help of that is because of the fact that the Battlehawks are playing the Battlehawks, were just like the Stallions we've seen last year for the USFL, but even more so that any game that they're on, or any time slot they're on, St. Louis is going to be watching, so they're going to get a huge bump in the ratings because of that. So that was an incredible game. Now, the Brahmas versus Defenders is actually the best game of the week in terms of TV ratings, by far. I mean, no disrespect to the Battlehawks Panthers, that game is not impressive compared to the Brahmas Defenders. Why? That beat any ESPN game last year. Not a single ESPN game, even the 2 playoff games that were on the ESPN for XFL, hit this high. The highest was the 920,000 between the Dragons and Defenders, which, number one, that was a primetime game, and number 2 was not going against March Madness stuff. This was a Brahmas Defenders game just in the middle of the day. The fact that it was able to beat out the Dragons Defenders is incredible. This is the game I believe that actually went against Purdue and Texas, if I'm not mistaken. But the fact that it was able to hit almost 1 million on ESPN and do better than any ESPN game last year is insane. Now, it may have done a bit worse than the Guardians Roughnecks game from last year. I can't remember for sure off the top of my head how the ratings was, because I know that was on FX as well. But I believe this still was actually better than what ESPN had that game. Again, I might be wrong about that. But for a pure ESPN broadcast, this was the best that they've ever had, or that the XFL had last year. This was better than. And then the Roughnecks Showboats, 703,000. That was a really solid number. Okay, it was a lot better than most of the games that ESPN had. Again, I believe that is better than both the playoff games the XFL had last year and ESPN. Now, this one did have to go against, the beginning of the NC State Duke game, which was a very big game, especially as somebody who lives in North Carolina. I can tell you that was a massive game for people. And I've already seen people talk about it online how, if you're in a group with people, because again, it was Easter Sunday, and, you're with a bunch of people, newsflash, most of them are going to want to watch the Elite Eight game. So the fact that it was able to have that good of ratings is solid. That's what the bottom line is. Despite the fact that the Renegade Stallions was a little bit of a disappointment, this was an incredible week, all things considered. Over 1 million viewers per game is a great attendance. And remember, they didn't even use their best channel. ABC has been the best of all of the over-the-air networks. It did a lot better than NBC did, even though NBC was better than Fox. So if they're able to keep somewhat decently with this, especially with all the publicity the UFL is getting, which is way more than both the XFL and USL had, I would not be shocked if we're able to consistently see Fox actually hit 1 million viewers. I mean, even just hitting 800,000 would actually be a decent success for Fox. But if we're talking 1 million, that's a huge deal if they're able to continue that. Whereas the attendance was just solid and the ratings were overall really good. These are incredible ratings, all things considered. Even though, again, I think the Renegade Stallions was a bit of a disappointment. When you have the Panthers Battlehawks hit 1.349 million, when you have the Defenders Brahmas hit only 40K under 1 million, this is really good. So overall, the TV ratings, massive success. And when you compare them to week 1 of the USL last year and XFL last year, again, XFL had the benefit of the ABC viewership and the fact that it was, the return of the XFL after 3 years. The USFL, not a single game hit over 1 million viewers. The ESPN game almost did better than the best game the USFL had in 2023's week 1. Let that sink in. That's incredible. And so, that'll do it. This has been Zob Fox. If you enjoy this content, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. Naturally, I do this every single week. Power rankings on Tuesdays, week reviews on Wednesdays, and then Friday will be the betting picks or the game picks. And for this week, watch out tomorrow. I will be doing the opening week tier list video for the UFL. So be on the lookout for that. And as always, have a great night.